Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into a story so audacious it should have been impossible. And yet, it unfolded right under the noses of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. For decades, Europe's ports and customs had been considered secure, every shipment accounted for, every border watched. But one night, somewhere in the Mediterranean, a covert mission moved uranium across continents. Unseen, unchallenged, and unforgettable. To some, it was survival. To others, an impossible theft that would haunt governments for decades. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you love stories from the hidden corners of history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Oh, and what time it is. I love seeing who's awake, discovering these secrets with me night after night, all across the world. Now settle in, let your thoughts slow down. Tonight, we're traveling back to the shadows of Europe and the Mediterranean, to a time when secrecy, audacity, and risk converged. And a heist began that no one was supposed to notice. The sea was calm when it should not have been, a glassy surface stretching into darkness, broken only by the faint hum of an engine that seemed too small to carry the weight of what lay hidden in its hold. Somewhere out there, far from land, far from prying eyes, a freighter sailed as if it belonged to no one, its name written in fading letters that would soon be spoken in whispers. Ships disappear in war. They sink in storms. They burn in accidents. But this one carried a cargo that could not simply be erased. 200 tons of uranium yellowcake sealed inside drums that looked like nothing more than harmless industrial pigment stacked neatly in the belly of the vessel. It was a shipment that was never supposed to exist, purchased with paper companies and fabricated contracts routed through the shadowy alleys of European commerce, where everything was for sale if you knew which door to knock on and how much to pay. And yet, here it was, crossing the Mediterranean under the flag of a ship that would not be remembered, destined for a port that would never appear in its logs. Those who planned the operation had treated it as a puzzle, a locked vault that had to be opened without setting off alarms. They had forged a company out of nothing, complete with stationery, executives, and a history that seemed as real as any long-standing business. They had bought the silence of men whose jobs were supposed to keep the system honest, but who discovered that integrity had a price, and that price could be met in cash, in favors, or in the subtle promise that their names would never surface in the light of scandal. Everything about the plan relied on precision, forged signatures that would pass not only an initial glance, but also the scrutiny of regulators trained to spot irregularities, documents that could withstand not one but multiple inspections, and shipping manifests that would hold together under the cold eyes of bureaucrats. What hung over every operative was not greed, nor even ambition, but fear. Israel's existence at the time was shadowed by the memory of war and the awareness that another war could come at any moment. A war in which conventional weapons might not be enough to secure survival. Dimona had been built in the desert as the ultimate guarantee, a facility shrouded in secrecy, presented to the world as a textile plant, while beneath the surface it hummed with reactors that needed only one thing: uranium. Without it, Dimona was just concrete and silence. With it, it was a promise of survival. That was the justification whispered in Tel Aviv, when doubts flickered, when someone wondered aloud if the risk was too high. Without this, one of the planners is remembered as saying, "Our people may one day not be here at all." And so the operation moved forward, with tension stretching like a wire that could snap at any moment. In Brussels, an operative posed as a businessman, carrying himself with the cool confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, while inside he knew that a single wrong look could undo years of preparation. He slid the forged contracts across a polished table, listening to the sound of paper on wood as though it were the sound of dice rolling. The Belgian trader studied the documents, his finger tracing the ink of one signature that looked perhaps a little too deliberate. A pause, the kind that could have lasted seconds or hours, until at last the trader nodded and pushed the papers back. the moment passing like a heartbeat spared. The operative smiled thinly, though he would later remember that brief hesitation as one of the longest seconds of his life. From Brussels to Antwerp, the plan tightened. Barrels were hoisted onto the docks under fog, cranes groaning as they lifted drums stenciled with lies. To the customs officers, they were harmless goods, the kind of cargo that moved across the continent every day. But one man lingered longer than the rest, squinting at the manifests as if something about the numbers did not sit right. He ran his finger down the list, looked at the barrels, then back again, the silence lengthening until a dock worker jostled him with a casual word, drawing his attention just enough for the papers to pass. That moment of hesitation would haunt the worker later, when the truth leaked, but on that night it was just another instance of curiosity brushed aside by the tide of commerce. The ship chosen to carry the barrels was not special. That was the point. A German-flagged freighter named Schiersberg A, small enough to be overlooked, unremarkable enough to blend into the endless flow of maritime trade. Its crew, however, was less ordinary. Some were bribed, others replaced, men who signed on with different expectations and found themselves bound to a voyage without explanation. A captain sat in his cabin, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Perhaps he told himself that cargo was cargo, that his job was to sail and not to ask questions. Perhaps he realized too late that there was no easy way to walk away once you had taken the first payment. Either way, the ship left port with the barrels neatly stacked in its hold, its papers in order, and its course set. The Mediterranean is vast, but it is also watched. Ships are logged, routes tracked, radio signals monitored. For the plan to work, the Schiersberg A would need to disappear, not forever, but long enough to make its transfer, long enough to slip into the blind spot of history. Somewhere at sea, another vessel waited, unmarked, unnamed, its crew drilled in silence. The two ships drew close in the night, the sea calm enough to permit a transfer that should have been impossible. Harnesses swung in the dark, ropes creaked, metal drums swayed between ships like pendulums carrying the weight of nations. One barrel slipped, a moment of panic as it swung dangerously close to the water before being pulled back, steadied, and lowered onto the waiting deck. The men worked without words, the only sounds the machinery and the sea, their breaths tight in their throats. By dawn, the barrels were gone, transferred, secured, their trail erased in salt and darkness. The Schiersberg A continued its voyage, now an empty shell, a ship stripped of its purpose. When it reappeared in maritime logs days later, there was nothing unusual in its paperwork, nothing to suggest it had carried a cargo that could alter the balance of power in the Middle East. Inspectors saw only an empty hold and a captain with calm eyes. The ship had completed its run, the cargo had vanished, and the world went on unaware. But secrets do not remain buried forever. In 1973, a journalist in London opened a file and began piecing together fragments of whispers, scraps of reports that European intelligence services had let slip. He followed the trail of a freighter that vanished for days, a shipment that could not be accounted for, a set of contracts that pointed to companies that seemed real but dissolved into nothing on closer inspection. He knew what he was touching was dangerous, that governments preferred silence over exposure, but he pressed on. When he laid the story before his editor, the words carried the weight of revelation. A ship, uranium, a vanishing act, and a conclusion too disturbing to ignore. The article hit the world like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading fast. Euratom was humiliated, its safeguards mocked. Diplomats blustered in private while avoiding the subject in public. Some suspected that Western intelligence had known all along and chosen to turn away, a betrayal not of one ally but of the very idea of non-proliferation. Others whispered that the theft succeeded precisely because too many wanted it to succeed, because the balance of power in the region was considered more important than the rules written on paper. The truth was never laid bare. Israel neither confirmed nor denied, and silence became the final shield, the last layer of the heist. And so, the story remains suspended between fact and shadow. The Mediterranean still rolls over the places where the transfer might have taken place, waves erasing every trace of the night, when barrels swung across black water and disappeared into history. No one has ever produced the missing cargo. No one has shown a photograph of the transfer. No one has stood in court to admit what happened. The Scheersberg A sails now as a ghost in memory, a reminder that the perfect crime does not end with celebration, but with silence, and that sometimes the greatest thefts are not those carried out in darkness, but those hidden forever in plain sight. The operation was called Plumbat, a name that sounds like nothing, a word that slips easily from the tongue without weight. But behind it was the weight of uranium, of survival, of betrayal, and of the uneasy knowledge that in the world of shadows, the greatest secrets are the ones we cannot prove, only feel in the gaps where the story should be complete, but never will be. And as the decades pass, as archives remain closed and voices remain silent, the question lingers, like a chill over calm seas. Did the heist succeed only because the world allowed it to? The night air over the Mediterranean carried a damp chill, and for the men waiting in silence near the darkened freighter, every sound seemed magnified. The lapping of waves against steel, the creak of mooring ropes, the faint groan of a hull shifting under its cargo, each noise carried with it the possibility of discovery, exposure, ruin. They had rehearsed every move countless times, yet when the moment arrived, when the Scheersberg A floated in the shadow of a plan that might tilt the balance of power in the Middle East, nerves ran taut like the rigging overhead. This was no ordinary shipment, no ordinary risk. Somewhere in the sealed containers below deck lay hundreds of tons of yellow cake, uranium ore, that no European watchdog would ever willingly allow into Israeli hands. It had been bought under a false flag, loaded under false pretenses. And now, if even a single mistake was made, the Mediterranean would become their tomb, and the operation would end in scandal before it even began. The men worked with the precision of thieves in a cathedral, their movements hushed and deliberate. Their cover story had been crafted months in advance, contracts drawn up by front companies, layers of corporate shells built in neutral ports, captains recruited and then quietly dismissed, crews shuffled like cards until not a single name on the manifest bore any resemblance to reality. And yet, even with the paperwork perfect, with false flags fluttering above, there was still the ocean itself, wide and unpredictable, where radar sweeps, patrol vessels, and nosy customs officials could undo them in an instant. The Scheersberg had already slipped out of Antwerp unnoticed, its cargo declared as Plumbat, a bland code word, the Latin root for lead, something of no consequence to inspectors who never opened the containers. But lead? It was not. And the men on board knew that once the cargo was gone, the vessel itself would become a ghost, a phantom ship whose journey would never appear to have been completed. The plan hinged on vanishing in plain sight. Ships disappear all the time. Storms, piracy, faulty radios. A delay of weeks, sometimes months, might raise an eyebrow, but not suspicion. By the time port authorities in Antwerp, Hamburg, or Genoa began asking questions, the cargo would already be under armed guard on Israeli soil, destined for facilities whose existence the world barely dared whisper about. For Israel, this was not greed, nor the vanity of technological prestige. It was survival. In a region surrounded by enemies, in a world where superpowers played games of denial and duplicity, the only way to guarantee safety was to hold the one weapon no enemy would dare challenge directly. The men aboard the Scheersberg understood this, and it made the fear bearable. Still, the night was long. The ship moved south, cutting through calm waters, its lights dimmed, its radio silent. Hours bled into days, the crew restless but controlled. They had been briefed to expect sudden changes, an order to alter course, to dock at a forgotten inlet in North Africa, or to rendezvous with another vessel under cover of darkness. Every sailor carried questions, but questions were dangerous. Better not to know the full truth. Better to obey and collect the reward when it was all over. Yet, in the corners of the ship, hushed conversations hinted at awareness. Men spoke of cargo too carefully guarded, of crates that did not match their bill of lading, of supervisors who carried themselves less like seamen and more like soldiers. The ship's captain, one of the few who had glimpsed the bigger picture, kept his composure, but even he could not silence the rumors entirely. Then, one night, the order came. The Scheersberg's course bent away from its stated route, its bow angled toward the desolate stretches of the eastern Mediterranean. There, somewhere beyond the horizon, was a meeting point known to only a handful of planners. Another ship waited, nameless, its registry erased, its crew trained for a single task, to receive what the world must never see. The operation would require hours of delicate transfer, cranes groaning under the weight of containers, while radios remained mute and signal lamps blinked in a code older than satellites. One slip, one loud clang of steel on steel, and any nearby fishing boat could stumble upon them. One flare in the night sky, and patrol craft might come racing, curious at first, then suspicious, then hostile. As the vessels drew closer, the men could feel the shift in atmosphere. Gone was the slow rhythm of a freighter at sea. Now, every movement was orchestrated, every lookout's gaze sharpened. Even the waves seemed to conspire, slapping against the hull as though eager to betray the secret unfolding above them. But fortune favored the bold. Under the cloak of darkness, the first container lifted, swaying gently in the night air before settling onto the deck of the waiting ship. Then another and another. The cargo moved like stolen treasure from one chest to another, disappearing into the anonymity of international waters. Hours passed. Sweat slicked hands, muscles ached, but the operation continued without a single interruption. When the final container was secured, when the last rope was tightened, a silence heavier than the cargo itself fell upon the deck. They had done it. The uranium was gone, but their work was not over. The Scheersberg had to reappear, stripped of its precious cargo, but intact enough to convince investigators of its mundane fate. To vanish entirely would raise alarm. To return empty-handed would invite scrutiny. And so, in the days that followed, the freighter wandered aimlessly, docking eventually in a port, with excuses as thin as its depleted hold. The crew, some bewildered, some complicit, went their separate ways, pockets lined, tongues silenced. For the public record, the Scheersberg was merely a troubled vessel with erratic schedules and careless bookkeeping. For the secret annals of intelligence, it was the stage on which one of the boldest smuggling operations of the 20th century had been performed. What none of the men knew then, as they stepped ashore, was that the ghost of the Scheersberg would not remain buried. Years later, when European intelligence agencies pieced together fragments of maritime records, when whispers reached the ears of investigative journalists, when governments began to suspect that uranium had vanished without trace, the story would surface. And when it did, the world would confront not merely a smuggling caper, but a revelation that a nation had crossed the line between civilian science and nuclear power. For now, though, the silence held. The crates had been delivered. The sea had washed away their tracks, and only those who had stood beneath the swaying containers in the dead of night could feel the enormity of what they had carried. Yet, even as Israel celebrated behind closed doors, even as the yellow cake was hidden away in secure facilities, a deeper unease took root. Secrets of this scale rarely stay buried forever, and the higher the stakes, the greater the danger of betrayal. Somewhere in Europe, records lingered. Somewhere among the crew, a memory could be pried loose by money or threat. Somewhere among rival services, a trace of the vanished uranium might yet lead back to its true destination. And when that trace was followed, when the first clue emerged, the silence around Operation Plumbat would begin to unravel, pulling the world into a revelation it was never meant to see. The silence that followed was as dangerous as the night of the transfer itself. In the weeks after the Scheersberg's cargo disappeared, those who had touched the operation felt a weight that was heavier than the ore itself. A successful heist leaves no trace, no noise, only absence, but in absence there is suspicion. In the offices of customs inspectors in Antwerp, the manifests of lead that had been declared now seemed curiously over-documented, as if someone had gone to unnecessary lengths to ensure its legitimacy. In Hamburg, a clerk noticed discrepancies between departure logs and arrival papers. Alone, these details meant little, but intelligence is often built not on solid stone, but on loose sand, and sand shifts under the smallest breeze. For those in Tel Aviv who now possessed the yellow cake, the challenge had shifted from acquisition to concealment. The ore did not arrive in Israel under its own name. Even within the secure confines of Haifa's harbor, the cargo was disguised, moved swiftly under the cover of night into warehouses whose ownership was buried under the same labyrinth of shell companies that had bought the ore in the first place. From there, trucks rolled southward, across desert roads where only a select few military convoys were permitted to pass without inspection. Their destination was the Negev, where the air shimmered with heat by day and the stars burned with merciless clarity by night. There, at Dimona, a facility officially described as a textile plant stood like an unacknowledged monument to secrecy. To the outside world, it was little more than an industrial project. To those who had orchestrated Plumbat, it was the crucible of survival. The uranium ore itself was nothing but raw material, inert until refined, but its very presence was both a shield and a danger. A shield because it promised that Israel's enemies would think twice before launching an attack that could unleash retaliation of unimaginable scale. A danger because if the secret were betrayed, if Euratom inspectors or the International Atomic Energy Agency traced the ore back to Antwerp, to Hamburg, to the Schiersberg's ghostly voyage, the political cost could isolate Israel completely. Allies in Europe might close their doors. Even the United States, balancing Cold War priorities, might be forced to distance itself. Thus, the ore was both lifeline and liability, and those who guarded it understood that their silence was now as important as their daring. But silence is fragile. Among the crew that had sailed on the Schiersberg, not all were seasoned operatives. Some were mercenaries, men motivated less by loyalty than by coin. They had been paid, yes, and some had drunk away their share in the taverns of Piraeus or Naples before the month was out. Loose talk was inevitable. A drunken boast about a cargo unloaded at sea, a whispered suggestion that their ship had been hijacked by its own crew, a slurred admission that crates marked as lead had vanished into thin air. Such fragments began to ripple outward. Intelligence agencies thrive on fragments. A rumor overheard in a bar could end up in a report in Brussels. A suspicious note in a port authority ledger might make its way to Paris. At first, the Europeans were merely puzzled. Uranium was tightly controlled under Euratom, and the idea that 200 tons could simply vanish seemed absurd. Yet, the paperwork was clear. The cargo had left Antwerp, bound for Genoa. The ship had departed, but it had never arrived. There was no record of storm, of seizure, of piracy. The Schiersberg itself eventually reappeared, empty, docked in a port, where its captain offered vague excuses about delays and mishaps. But where then was the cargo? Missing shipments could mean fraud, theft, smuggling. But uranium? That implied intent, organization, and resources far beyond criminal syndicates. That implied a state. Inside European intelligence circles, the whispers grew louder. Some suspected Libya, whose leader, Muammar Gaddafi, had begun courting suppliers for his own nuclear dreams. Others muttered about South Africa, already entangled in clandestine nuclear ambitions and suspected of ties to Israel. But the most persistent suspicion pointed to Tel Aviv. After all, Israel had resisted international inspection of Dimona, insisting it was a research center. American inspectors who had been granted limited access complained that visits were carefully stage-managed, entire wings sealed off before their arrival. The disappearance of uranium from Antwerp, the ghostly voyage of the Scheersberg, the sudden reappearance of the vessel without its crew. All these elements fit together too neatly to ignore. Yet, suspicion was not proof. For years, the story lay in the shadows, circulating in classified memos, but never surfacing in public. And within Israel, the men who had orchestrated the operation grew older, carrying their silence like a burden. Some believed the risk had passed, that the world had forgotten. Others were less certain. For the Mossad officers who had managed Plumbat, paranoia became second nature. They watched the European press for signs, listened to diplomatic chatter, measured every rumor like a physician reading a pulse. For a long time, the patient appeared stable. Then, in the early 1970s, the patient stirred. Journalists in London began asking questions. The Sunday Times had developed a reputation for probing beneath official narratives, and its insight team had cultivated sources in European intelligence. One source hinted at a missing ship, another at vanished uranium. At first, the editors dismissed the tale as fanciful, but as fragments piled up, port records, crew lists that did not match, corporate entities dissolved too swiftly after a single transaction, the story began to take shape. The hook was irresistible. Uranium smuggling, ghost ships, the specter of nuclear weapons in the Middle East. What had been whispers in intelligence circles was now a potential headline. For Israel, this was the nightmare scenario. The policy of nuclear ambiguity, amimat, depended on silence, on plausible deniability. If the story broke, if the world believed that Israel had stolen its way into the nuclear club, the ambiguity would shatter. Diplomats in Tel Aviv worked furiously, pressing allies to dissuade the press, hinting that exposure would destabilize the region. Yet, journalists are not diplomats, and curiosity cannot be bribed or threatened away once it takes hold. When the Sunday Times published its expose in December 1973, it landed like a depth charge in calm water. The article laid out the skeleton of Operation Plumbat, the purchase through a front company, the voyage of the Scheersberg, the disappearance of the cargo, the suspicion that it had been diverted to Israel. For the first time, the secret had a name, a narrative, a place in public consciousness. Governments could no longer pretend ignorance. Israel, true to its doctrine, neither confirmed nor denied. Silence was its shield, but the damage was done. The world now believed that Israel had not only pursued nuclear weapons, but had outmaneuvered Europe itself to secure the material. Inside Israel, the reaction was mixed. Some saw vindication, proof of ingenuity and resolve. Others saw danger, fearing that exposure would invite sanctions, isolation, even preemptive strikes. Within the intelligence community, the lesson was seared into memory. No operation, no matter how perfect, remains invisible forever. Paper trails linger, memories crack, whispers spread. Secrecy is never permanent, only temporary. Yet, despite exposure, the world did little. The Cold War imposed its own priorities, and neither Washington nor Moscow wished to ignite a fire they could not control. The story faded from headlines, but it never vanished entirely. Even today, the ghost of the Scheersberg haunts the margins of history, a reminder that behind every official policy, behind every declaration of peaceful intent, there are men in the shadows orchestrating heists that change the destiny of nations. And so, Operation Plumbat stands as more than a smuggling caper. It is the tale of how a small nation, cornered by enemies and constrained by treaties, dared to steal the raw material of apocalypse from under the noses of the world. It is a story of shadows, of ships that vanish and reappear, of containers lifted in silence beneath a starless sky. And it is a story that warns us, no matter how carefully guarded, no matter how deeply buried, the truth has a way of resurfacing, dragging with it the ghosts of those who thought they had escaped the tide. The truth has a habit of returning like a tide, slow at first and then inexorable. And when it came back, it carried names, numbers, places, and the nervous scribbles of people who could no longer keep their mouths shut. Those who had been closest to the operation felt it first as a tightening behind the ribcage, a small, private ache that said the world had started to turn its head. For the operatives who had watched drums of yellowcake swing between hulls in a moonless sea, for the captains who had taken bribes and kept their eyes down, for the clerks who had pushed papers across polished tables in Brussels, the leak felt like a blade sliding free. It cut away complacency. It demanded judgment. In a small, windowless office in a building that smelled of old coffee and cigarette smoke, a journalist laid out the thread he had been following. He worked slowly, with a patience not born of indulgence, but of necessity. A wrong leap could ruin him, or worse. He fed fragments into a neat pile, the Schiersberg's altered transits, the list of corporate shells that dissolved after a single transaction, the ledger entry showing lead, plumbat, sold at a price that made little commercial sense. Each piece alone meant little. Together they formed the outline of a picture that made his fingers tremble as he arranged them on the table. His editor leaned back, listening to the sound of the clock, the shudder of the building in the wind. "If this is true," the editor said, "we are holding a grenade." Across the sea, in safe rooms lit by the kind of light that refuses to flatter, men in suits that fit too well spoke in low voices as if the walls had ears. European intelligence services swapped fragments, like spies trading currency. A file from Genoa matched a whisper from Antwerp, a name on a payroll ledger linked to a P.O. box in Brussels. Officials who had a duty to protect their country's secrets found that their duties had become tangled with their discomfort. There were old alliances to protect, trade relations to consider, and the diplomatic arithmetic of the Cold War, where every public scandal could be a lever for the Soviets or a wedge for the Americans. There was also a meaner calculus, a small ally with nuclear aspirations balanced against the convenience of geopolitics. Some men who had sworn oaths decided that the correct course was to murmur and close the file. Within Tel Aviv, reactions diverged along a different spectrum. For the architects of the operation, the exposure was a humiliation and a proof of concept. They had achieved what they had set out to do. Material had been acquired and transported, and a program that could never be explained in polite diplomatic language had been nourished. Yet, the success was not a bomb. It was a living thing that demanded feeding and defense. The most dangerous moments came not during the heist, but afterward, in the long gray years where every rumor could be an ember threatening to become fire. Leadership in Jerusalem convened emergency briefings where the word damage control was treated like a talisman. Envoys were dispatched to friendly capitals, their speeches rehearsed, their faces composed for cameras that might not yet point in their direction. The journalists, for their part, did not work in isolation. The Sunday Times Insight team had cultivated sources in foreign ministries, and among courier drivers, port clerks, and retired shipping brokers who left hints where a less curious mind would see only noise. One source, an elderly dock foreman who had been at Antwerp for decades, remembered the night the barrels were loaded and let slip a detail that seemed insignificant until a line on a manifest made it mean everything. The drums had been marked in a way inconsistent with standard practice, a tiny mislabeling that later linked to a front company's paper. Memory is a fragile thing, but it can harden under pressure. A single recollection in the right pair of ears becomes evidence. Evidence changes the shape of the world because it pulls the abstract into the realm of the verifiable. A government that can point to facts can no longer hide behind plausible deniability. That's why the diplomats moved quickly, attempting to blunt the impact before the story grew teeth. Envoys called in favors, suggested off-the-record briefings where concerns could be soothed and reporters could be coaxed away from their investigations. The press, however, smelled an opportunity, a scoop that might unsettle the state assumptions of Europe's post-war order. For editors, moral certitude can be less persuasive than the rush of a story that promises to change readership patterns. For the journalists, the story was not just about detonations and statecraft. It was about the mechanics of how a modern state, supposedly bound by laws and accords, could reach into the marketplaces of democracy and take what it needed. Those mechanics were the real theater of the operation. The forged companies were not mere names on a document. They were layered palimpsests of identities, each one more believable because it appeared grounded in record. Letterheads were procured from stationery shops under false pretenses. Bank accounts opened in the names of dead men and shell NGOs, certificates and seals copied meticulously. It was tedious work, the kind that demands time, patience, and a steady hand. But it is precisely that tedium that fools inspectors. And so, authorities are trained to detect sloppiness, not to suspect the depth of craft that passes itself off as ordinary competence. On paper, Plumbat looked unspectacular. That was the genius of it. Alongside the paperwork, the operation employed a choreography of physical tradecraft. Dead drops were established not in alleyways, but in shipping yards and in obscure warehouses that saw enough traffic to make any single departure seem unremarkable. A crate labeled machinery parts would be left under the cover of darkness in a nondescript storage locker, retrieved later by a courier who left behind a different crate intended to maintain the illusion of inventory fluctuation. Surveillance watched surveillance. Men in plain clothes trailed suspicious figures until the trail went cold. Cameras captured registrations and then vanished into pools of static whenever someone looked too closely. Cellular communication did not exist as we now know it, but messages passed through coded telegrams, innocuous-seeming instructions to ship certain goods to a given pier. The language was bureaucratic and thus dull, which made it perfect for concealment. On the docks, the conspiracy took on a more tactile life. Cranes hummed, winches creaked, and men shouted orders, their voices swallowed by the mass of activity that is a port's normal state. Containers changed hands with the rapid cadence of commerce, but there were orchestrated pauses. A crane operator who suddenly called for a mechanical inspection without explanation, giving the handlers time to shift certain drums elsewhere. A customs inspector who mysteriously misplaced a clerk's list, creating a brief window when documents could be altered. These were not grand cinematic confrontations. They were the patient work of men who understood that a heist is usually won through the accumulation of small gestures that together form an unassailable whole. And then there were the human edges, the vulnerabilities that neither money nor training can always seal. Men drink, women write letters to absent lovers, old grudges flare up into careless words. One of the crew, a man with a bad knee and a temper softened only by the promise of a future in a quiet coastal village, took solace in a tavern and told a story about the strange load they had carried. It was not the detailed confession a court would demand, but it was enough for a sympathetic ear to carry it to a reporter who liked to trade in half-truths that could be steeled into certainty. In another case, a bank clerk, morally jaundiced by years of bureaucracy, noticed an account that showed an unusual flow of funds and pocketed a photocopy for reasons he could not later explain. Blackmail, conscience, curiosity. Any of these can loosen tongues better than threats or bribes can. The psychological cost on those who pulled the strings was intense. For many operatives, the victory was private and awkward. There were no parades, no medals, only the quiet knowledge that a line had been crossed. They rationalized it in ways that made sense to them: the calculus of survival, the memory of losses, the conviction that the outcome would keep lives safe. Yet, moral calculus is a poor anesthetic for the gnawing nights when one lies awake and imagines the faces of men in foreign parliaments who might one day raise the cutoff demands of an outraged world. Some officers drank, others retreated into a compartmentalized silence. Most, stubbornly, carried on, for the work of statecraft is endless, and today's success is the prelude to tomorrow's risk. When the story finally found print, the public reaction was immediate and disorienting. The headline that blared from newsstands did not merely accuse, it implied a betrayal of the rules that post-war Europe had sought to create to guard against the very arms race now being sneaked into the Middle East. Citizens who had trusted their institutions felt the ground shift. Parliamentarians demanded answers. Diplomats in capitals shifted in their chairs. But political response is a slow machine, clogged with bureaucracy and the very self-preserving instincts that made the heist possible in the first place. Some governments issued sternly worded statements about the sanctity of non-proliferation while simultaneously opening classified inquiries to see what, if anything, their own security services had known. A reluctance to publicly scold an ally who sat on a strategic fault line mingled with genuine concern about the message that public chastisement would send to adversaries. In the corridors where policy is negotiated, the operation was debated not in the language of ethics, but in a lexicon of balance sheets, bargaining chips, and risk management. Journalists, meanwhile, kept pulling at the frayed ends of the story. They traveled to ports, interviewed seamen who had aged into silence, and dug through company registries that had stubbornly left digital footprints in the analog world. They subpoenaed documents, made calls to former intelligence officers prepared to talk in quieting rooms for a price, and cultivated young clerks willing to exchange anonymity for a sense that they had done the right thing. The rabbit hole deepened. Assets, logs, and invoices produced patterns that were harder to dismiss as coincidence. One revelation that shifted the debate was the discovery that certain shipments had been approved by officials who claimed ignorance, but whose paperwork bore their signatures. A simple human trait, trust in the system, had been exploited. Officials who assumed that manifest reviews were a matter of routine procedure had not expected that someone would go to the trouble of making the routine appear unremarkable while embedding something far more extraordinary within. The realization forced a re-evaluation of complacency across multiple ports and agencies. The diplomatic fallout played out in closed rooms. In Brussels, officials demanded classified briefings from member states. In Washington, the State Department convened a circle of experts who argued over posture. To confront Israel openly would fracture a strategic relationship, but to ignore the charges would erode public faith in international agreements meant to contain the very spread of nuclear material that Plumbat had exploited. The United States, juggling a bipolar world where every action reverberated against the Soviet counter, found the calculus particularly repellent. Yet, geopolitical self-interest often beats public principle, and the decisions that shaped policy were less about public virtue than about whose interests were best served by silence. Within Israel, the internal politics were thorny. There were those who argued that the exposure meant it was time to declare openly what had been achieved, to remove ambiguity and thereby secure deterrence through clarity. Others feared that public admission would invite an international crusade, bring the wrath of major powers, and possibly prompt preemptive measures from those who felt threatened. The decision to maintain Amamut, the strategic fog, was reaffirmed. Silence remained the official posture, a shield that had proven useful in the past when clarity might cost allies and provoke enemies. The logic was cold and pragmatic. Better to claim nothing and let others guess than to provide an explicit target for political demands. Yet, beneath that cold logic churned human stories of compromise and regret. A bureaucrat in a ministry in Paris who had signed off on benign-sounding permits for shipments that later proved suspicious found himself unable to sleep. Another figure, a mid-level intelligence officer in Rome who had once admired the audacity of the operation, later felt that admiration sour into unease. "We made a mess of the rules," he would say years later, "and then we pretended we had not." Morality in the world of espionage is often a conversation held half asleep, and the half-awake cognitions did not always line up neatly with the claims of national necessity. For the men who had carried the cargo into the desert, truck drivers, dock workers, and soldiers, the aftermath was quieter. They had been paid, given orders, and expected obedience. For some, the payments had changed lives in small but consequential ways. A house repaired, a child's schooling paid for, a debt cleared. For others, the money merely bought a night of forgetfulness. Their moral calculations were immediate and personal rather than geopolitical. When asked years later, their answers were flavored with pragmatic detachment. A job is a job. A man does what he must. Yet, Even among these men, a few could not entirely let the memory go. Nights at sea, the creak of rope, the smell of diesel and metal, such sensory details are hard to exorcise. In quieter moments, some imagined the possible consequences, and those imaginations sometimes brought shame. The story of Plumbat did not end with print. It metastasized into investigations, polite inquiries, and the slow, grinding work of bureaucratic self-preservation. Committees convened, and their reports, often redacted and vague, said more by what they omitted than by what they recorded. In the quiet, senior officials made decisions to shield certain records, to mark files as sensitive, to place documents in vaults where only a handful could touch them. The instinct was human and understandable. Information is power, and without it, actors cannot be held to account. Yet, the selective archiving has a consequence. The historical record becomes a palimpsest of official amnesia and private memory. It is a peculiar sort of victory when the operation is successful and the world chooses to look away. States make moral bargains all the time. They decide which rules to uphold and which to set aside when they feel it necessary. The existence of that calculus does not make it less moral. It makes it human in the rawest sense. Those who orchestrated Plumbat believed they had saved lives, delayed existential peril, and bought time. Their critics argued that the act undermined the norms designed to prevent proliferation, and that such unilateral action increased the likelihood of miscalculation and escalation. Both sides had a point. Both sides were right and wrong in different measures. History seldom offers pure absolutes. Years later, when the immediate scandal faded from public view, the residue remained in other forms. Intelligence services studied the operation as a case study, codifying both its strengths and vulnerabilities. New protocols were drafted to tighten the tightest seams, manifest checks made more rigorous, and cooperative frameworks built to ensure that no single shipment could vanish into secrecy again so easily. The paradox was bitter. The very success of the heist prompted reforms aimed at preventing its repetition, which in turn would make similar operations harder for all actors in the future. But human ingenuity found new cracks. Where one route closed, others opened. Black markets adapt, front companies morph, and the ingenuity that fuels illicit enterprise finds new venues. The world learned to patch the holes Plumbat had exposed, but the culture of secrecy that allowed the operation to take place did not vanish overnight. In the long arc of strategy, some judged that Plumbat had been a necessary crime, others that it had been a dangerous precedent. Time would tell which view held more weight. Among the journalists who had chased the story, there was a mixture of triumph and unease. Some reveled in the power of their reporting to compel public debate. Others recognized that revelation can have unintended consequences. A newspaper's front-page expose fuels public discussion, but can also harden the positions of those who feel attacked, prompting them to retreat and obscure more carefully. The job of the journalist is to illuminate, but illumination sometimes produces shadows elsewhere. In private, conversations between former participants took on the quality of confession. A retired officer in a cafe confessed to a young reporter, "We played a dangerous hand. We thought it was the only one on the table." He spoke not to justify but to explain, a kind of historical inventory taking that admits error without necessarily seeking forgiveness. Another former planner, when asked if he would do it again, smiled thinly and said, "When your nation sings for its life, you learn to play the notes you must." There is a grim poetry to such statements. Morality, when measured against national survival, becomes a ledger of difficult choices. And yet, for every man who rationalized, there were those who could not. Families of men who had been lost in earlier conflicts saw the operation as a kind of betrayal of the principles for which their kin had fought. Internationalists argued that the erosion of treaties in defense of perceived necessity weakened the fabric of a cooperative post-war order. The ethical debates did not conclude. They simply shifted venue, moving from the streets into universities, from parliaments into think tanks, where they would be reheated and restated for decades. Operation Plumbat left behind artifacts as well as arguments. Shipping manifests, once considered the mundane detritus of commerce, became historical documents of considerable significance. Bank transfers decades later were subpoenaed in unrelated cases and produced lines that academic historians would later trace with the forensic sensitivity of archaeologists. The operation's footprint was subtle but real, scattered across ledgers and in the memory of a handful of men who refused, for reasons both noble and selfish, to forget. Time, that indifferent editor, lopsidedly erases as it preserves. As the men who lived the operation passed into retirement or death, their stories splintered between recollection and silence. Their grandchildren might one day read of a vanished ship and wonder at the magnitude of a secret their forebears carried in silence. Historians, years hence, would sift through archives opened in different political climates and assemble narratives that were never fully possible in the heat of the moment. There is a certain human cruelty in how these stories resolve. The boldest acts, those that force the world to reckon with uncomfortable truths, are rarely rewarded in their time. The planners of Plumbat did not receive medals publicly. They received secrecy and the private knowledge that their nation had averted a potential vulnerability. They also received suspicion, both external and, in some measure, internal. Security services that prize discretion often find that discretion rewards as much as it punishes. A life lived in shadow invites a kind of loneliness that is hard to describe and harder to reconcile. The sea kept its secret because for a time men were willing to keep theirs. But secrets self-propagate, like seeds in wind. One gust, and they find soil. The Shearsburg's route and the drums it carried would not be merely maritime trivia. They would be a lesson in the fragility of systems designed by good intentions and the resilience of those who choose to exploit them. Plumbat was not merely a theft of material. It was a theft of trust, an expropriation of the shared assumption that the rules governing weapons of mass destruction would be adjudicated not by a small circle of desperate actors, but by a considered, transparent, international process. In the end, the story that folded into the Sunday Times was more than a single article. It was the opening of a conversation about what nations owe to each other and what they owe to themselves. It forced questions that would echo through cabinets and committees for years. When is clandestine action justified? Who decides? What is the acceptable cost of a secret kept for national survival? Those are not questions with neat answers. They are fraught with history and the messy arithmetic of human fear. Decades after the drums swung in the dark and the Shearsburg re-entered the world as an empty hull, the conversation continues. The Mediterranean rolls on, ignorant and vast, indifferent to the dramas played upon its surface. But people remember. They remember because memory is durable in ways bureaucracy is not. It lodges in the bones and in the voices of those who lived it, then passes to children and to histories and to the quiet scribes who will not let the whole truth be buried with the men who once held it. And so, Plumbat remains, in equal parts heroism and transgression, ingenuity and impropriety. It is a story for which the world has no final verdict, because such verdicts require an appetite for clarity the world often lacks. The operation forced the world to ask itself whether survival justifies transgression, whether the rules by which nations govern themselves can be bent for the sake of a perceived greater good, and whether in the fog of geopolitics the line between theft and necessity may be drawn, erased, and redrawn again. If history has a taste for irony, it is this. A scheme to secure safety by secret theft ends up exposing the very vulnerability it meant to close. The heist that was meant to be invisible set in motion. Inquiries, debates, and reforms that would change how states think about materials, manifests, and the trust they place in one another. The men who pulled the levers of that night, the planners, the sailors, the clerks, left marks both intentional and accidental. They changed the course of policy in ways small and enormous. They taught their adversaries and allies alike how a state might reach when cornered, and they taught subsequent generations how such reach could be both necessary and corrosive. And in the quiet hours, when the sea lays its hand flat against a moonless horizon, one can imagine the faint echo of drums rolling, the creak of rope, the breath of men working in the dark. It is not the sound of triumph. It is the sound of choices made in private, of bargains struck between the living and the future, of secrets folded and tucked into vaults that open only when the world is ready to look. Plumbat is, among other things, a test of that readiness. It asks whether humanity can agree on the limits of courage as it intersects with deceit, whether the international order can be both compassionate and firm, whether a world that demands transparency can also grant the small mercies that states sometimes require. The answers have not been simple, and perhaps they never will be. The Scheersberg and its lost cargo remain an emblem of the age, an act of daring, a breach of trust, a lesson in the hazardous art of survival. For those who love the clarity of moral tales, it will always be messy. For those who live by the hard arithmetic of statecraft, it will often be an ugly necessity. Either way, the heist lives on in memory and in policy, a reminder that in the great ledger of nations, some entries are written in ink while others are scrawled in pencil and hidden between the pages. The revelation did not land quietly. It tore through diplomatic channels like a spark across dry tinder. Brussels, Paris, London, capitals that had long assumed stability in the post-war order suddenly found themselves awash with uncertainty. Intelligence briefings, usually conducted behind locked doors with a controlled audience, multiplied into urgent gatherings, their rooms thick with cigarette smoke and nervous whispers. Maps of shipping lanes and European ports were spread across tables. Each line traced a potential route, each annotation a possible betrayal. Men in suits leaned over them, counting days, hours, and possible witnesses. How could this have happened under our noses? A diplomat whispered, half to himself, half to the room. His colleagues said nothing, because to answer would be to admit their own failures. The U.S. reaction was measured, cautious, and impatient all at once. The State Department convened back-to-back meetings with advisors from the CIA and the Department of Energy, tracing the implications of the leak not just for Israel, but for the broader nuclear balance in the Middle East. Washington was acutely aware that public pressure could compel action against a close ally, but the facts presented an uncomfortable reality. Uranium had been diverted from Europe in a manner that circumvented international safeguards, and a small, determined nation had outmaneuvered sophisticated intelligence networks. The room smelled of stale coffee and the faint tang of fear. Even seasoned officers felt the weight of a geopolitical miscalculation that might not yet be visible to the public, but whose consequences would ripple outward over decades. Inside Europe, suspicion hardened into anger. Officials in Brussels demanded immediate explanations, calling for emergency audits of ports and shipping companies. In Antwerp, a customs officer who had once noticed minor discrepancies in manifests was suddenly recalled for questioning. Men in Hamburg were asked to testify regarding the Scheersberg's voyage, and even clerks who had dutifully processed invoices years ago found themselves facing inquiries they had no context to answer. The bureaucracy groaned under its own weight, and every memo written in haste carried the unmistakable sense of panic. An operation that had once seemed invisible now loomed like a specter over the continent. Israel, meanwhile, remained composed, or at least as composed as those who carry the heaviest of secrets can appear. Within the walls of Mossad's offices, the senior planners of Plumbat reviewed the fallout with a clinical detachment. The men and women who had orchestrated the operation decades before knew they were walking a knife edge. Any misstep now could provoke international isolation or, worse, retaliation. Yet they had counted the risks before, and their confidence was built on the meticulous detail of the past. Every shipment, every shell company, every forged signature had been considered and executed with precision. Still, exposure is a living thing. It gnaws at the edges of certainty, and even perfection cannot completely immunize against the curiosity and persistence of journalists and investigators. The fallout was not limited to the international stage. Within Israel, the revelation sparked internal debate that was sharp and unrelenting. Ministers questioned whether the secrecy had been worth the risk, whether the gamble of Plumbat, so bold in its execution, was sustainable in a world that could now track the outlines of such operations. Security councils convened, their rooms humming with tension. Generals and diplomats argued not over legality, but over optics and survivability. One senior official spoke plainly. "We did what we had to do. The world may not forgive us, but our survival demanded this course." Another countered, "Survival is fragile. Exposure threatens more than credibility. It threatens the alliances that keep us alive." Voices rose, then fell into silence, each participant weighing loyalty against prudence, principle against necessity. Across the Mediterranean, the journalists who had first smelled the story sensed the game was changing. The Sunday Times expose had been just the opening salvo. Now, the ripple effect extended into other European papers and intelligence leaks. A London correspondent, following whispers from Paris and Rome, pieced together that the shipment's disappearance was only part of a larger puzzle involving shell corporations and falsified manifests. Each new fragment strengthened the narrative. A small nation had successfully orchestrated a transcontinental diversion of uranium, an achievement both audacious and terrifying in its implications. Meanwhile, operatives who had once moved in shadows felt the slow pressure of exposure. Some were quietly summoned to meet with European counterparts, ostensibly for routine debriefs, but in reality as part of a coordinated effort to track down every thread of the Plumbat operation. One retired sailor, long settled in a coastal village, was approached under the pretense of a historical interview. The questions were innocent on the surface, routes taken, cargo descriptions, but each answer was cross-checked, each memory a potential key to a larger puzzle. He understood instinctively what was being tested. Discretion and memory were as dangerous as any physical weapon in this game. The operation's fallout also extended into the clandestine corridors of intelligence agencies themselves. European services began scrutinizing their own processes, asking hard questions about how such a diversion could occur undetected. Were protocols insufficient? Had human error allowed this breach? Or, more dangerously, had someone within their own ranks been compromised? In quiet offices, analysts ran simulations of the Shearsberg's voyage, attempting to identify anomalies, to reconstruct the chain of custody, to map every decision point where intervention might have occurred. The hunt was methodical, meticulous, and relentless. The men and women behind the operation were aware of it, their nerves taut, their sense of vigilance sharpened to a razor's edge. Diplomatic tensions escalated as inquiries reached ministerial levels. France and Belgium lodged formal questions, demanding explanations that were met with vague reassurances and carefully worded denials. The European press amplified every hint of mismanagement, and debates in parliaments became arenas for national pride and recrimination. Israel's official response remained the same: silence, the elegant ambiguity that preserved operational security but left the world guessing. Allies knew better than to press too hard, fearing that overt confrontation could destabilize the region further. Even within intelligence circles, the story carried personal consequences. Officers who had once collaborated with Israeli operatives found themselves under scrutiny, their careers subtly affected by association. Classified files were reopened. Correspondence was combed for errors or omissions. The fallout became a quiet, insidious form of punishment, reputations damaged not by public scandal but by the weight of internal suspicion. Some officers, previously confident in their networks, began to question the reliability of their contacts, the loyalty of their colleagues, and the vulnerability of operations that had seemed foolproof. Amid the international storm, those in Israel tasked with safeguarding Dimona and related facilities doubled security protocols. New procedures were instituted for transporting materials, for managing manifests, and for vetting personnel. The operations architects understood that exposure, even partial, demanded enhanced operational security. Every movement of sensitive material would now be doubly, triply, and quadruply monitored. What had once been audacious and elegant now required layers of caution that dulled the thrill of the heist but preserved the advantage it had bought. Back in Europe, investigative journalists began to uncover secondary threads that linked Plumbat to broader networks. Shipping companies that had seemed innocuous were traced to business figures with murky political connections. Bank accounts led to offshore entities with minimal oversight. Corporate filings were discovered to have been backdated or falsified. Each discovery confirmed what had already been suspected. Plumbat was not the act of rogue individuals, but a state-guided operation executed with precision and audacity. The public, however, remained largely unaware of the operation's scale, seeing only fragments of a story too complex for newspapers to fully render. Inside intelligence agencies, debates continued about the ethics of exposure. Was the revelation a triumph for transparency, or had it unnecessarily risked national security? Analysts and officers discussed the delicate balance between secrecy and accountability, arguing late into the night. Some feared that the story's publication would embolden adversaries. Others argued that exposing the vulnerabilities forced a reckoning that would ultimately strengthen safeguards. No consensus emerged, only the uneasy understanding that operations of this scale always bore a dual cost: the risk of discovery and the burden of memory. At the personal level, the planners of Plumbat grappled with mixed emotions. Pride in the flawless execution mingled with anxiety over exposure. One retired officer, recalling the night the uranium drums were hidden in the desert, reflected on the long chain of decisions that had carried the operation to success. Each choice, each forged signature, each clandestine meeting had been a brush stroke in a careful painting of deceit and necessity. And yet, with revelation came the haunting sense that their work would never be fully appreciated, only dissected and debated in corridors far from where the operation had unfolded. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity. Letters, memos, and secret communiques traveled between capitals, some containing veiled threats, others overt inquiries. Governments sought to determine whether Israel's nuclear capabilities were now an open secret or remained plausibly deniable. Allies in Europe attempted to negotiate, to coax, and sometimes to intimidate, all while keeping public postures carefully neutral. The delicate game of perception management was in full swing, with Plumbat at its center. Meanwhile, the journalists who had broken the story pursued follow-ups, tracing money trails and company records. One young reporter discovered that even shell companies had small, telltale inconsistencies. A post office box in Brussels not matching corporate filings, signatures that seemed slightly off, a director who had vanished without explanation. Every detail became a thread, potentially unraveling a story that had already shaken governments. Editors knew the stakes. Publishing could have diplomatic repercussions, but withholding could mean missing a historic narrative. Even as the world debated, the operation itself remained operationally complete. The uranium had reached its destination. The research programs it supported continued under the cover of ambiguity. In some sense, the heist had been perfect, executed with precision and audacity. The fallout was political and psychological, not physical. Yet the shadow of exposure lingered, a constant reminder to those who had planned it that even the most meticulous operation cannot entirely escape the long arm of scrutiny. Part 9, in essence, is the world catching up. Nations grappling with the audacity of the theft, intelligence services reassessing their vulnerabilities, diplomats navigating the treacherous waters of alliance and accountability, and operatives confronting the long-term consequences of their daring. It is the unfolding drama of how a perfectly executed heist can echo across decades, reshaping perceptions, alliances, and the very rules by which nations measure trust and deception. The world eventually turned, as it always does, with a rhythm neither fast nor forgiving, and yet some echoes of Plumbat refused to fade. Decades had passed since the drums vanished into the desert, since shell companies had been forged and forgotten, since the last courier had exhaled in relief at the quiet port. The operation, long executed with audacious precision, had achieved what it intended: uranium delivered, programs sustained, deterrence quietly ensured. But survival exacts its toll in unseen ways, and the real reckoning came not in headlines, nor in parliamentary debates, nor even in secret inquiries. It came in the weight of history, in the slow accumulation of memory, in the faint but unyielding insistence that some acts, no matter how necessary, are never entirely erased. In the quiet offices of intelligence agencies across Europe, analysts still pored over the remnants of Plumbat. Declassified files, redacted to the point of absurdity, offered tantalizing glimpses of the operation. Shipping manifests misaligned by millimeters, bank transfers routed through labyrinthine conduits, and names of men who had vanished into anonymity, their deeds folded into the machinery of secrecy. For younger officers, the story was almost mythic, a case study in audacity that seemed too perfect to be real. Older men, retired and wary, remembered the nights of tension, the meticulous choreography of misdirection, the sleepless hours counting risk as if it were a tangible currency. Some spoke of it in hushed tones over coffee, others refused to acknowledge it at all. But all understood, in the marrow of their bones, that Plumbat had set a standard for both brilliance and moral ambiguity. The legacy unfolded not only in memory, but in policy. Shipping inspections grew stricter, manifests more scrutinized, and international non-proliferation agreements sharpened. Ports that had once been corridors of easy passage became gauntlets of bureaucratic vigilance, their ordinary hums now laced with suspicion. In some ways, Plumbat had changed the world not by the uranium it delivered, but by the lessons it imposed, that human ingenuity will always probe the limits of oversight, that audacity thrives in gaps between rules, and that the boundary between necessity and transgression is fragile and often invisible until it snaps. Within Israel, the echoes were equally profound. While the men who orchestrated the operation had long since moved into retirement or quiet advisory roles, but their fingerprints remained on the nation's strategic posture. The secrecy surrounding Dimona and related nuclear programs persisted, codified as a principle rather than a contingency. Generations of operatives learned to navigate the gray zones between what could be revealed and what must remain hidden, each instruction underwritten by the memory of Plumbat's audacity. The story became less about a single heist and more about the ethos it established, that survival sometimes requires bending rules, that perfection in planning can outweigh public approbation, and that secrecy is both shield and burden. Abroad, the ripple effects continued in subtler ways. Allies and adversaries alike studied the operation, tracing its contours in archival records and whispered testimonies. Some nations adjusted their security protocols, learning from the mistakes of those who had been outmaneuvered. Others took note of the boldness, storing away the lesson that audacity and patience often outweigh brute force or legislation. And somewhere in the corridors of power, men who had once underestimated the small nation that executed Plumbat reconsidered their assumptions, realizing that in intelligence, the most dangerous actor is often the one no one sees coming. The journalists who first exposed fragments of the operation watched its afterlife unfold with ambivalence. They had pulled back the veil, ignited debates, and forced governments to account for shadows long ignored. Yet even they understood that the full truth would never be known publicly. Many of the most delicate details remained classified, some likely forever, and the gaps between revelation and reality created a narrative that was as much about inference as about fact. The tension between exposure and concealment had produced an entirely new story, one in which the audience could never fully grasp the depth of ingenuity, the risks taken, or the moral compromises made. Among those who had participated directly, memory carried both pride and quiet remorse. The sailors, clerks, and operatives who had handled the uranium, forged the paperwork, and coordinated movements in perfect secrecy lived with a duality. They had succeeded beyond measure, yet their triumph existed only in shadows. They could not celebrate publicly, could not claim honor beyond the silent nods of their peers. In moments of reflection, they sometimes questioned whether the secrecy had been worth it, whether the moral cost had been too high, whether a world that might someday learn the full story would judge them as heroes, rogues, or something far more ambiguous. Plumbat, in effect, became a mirror. It reflected the ingenuity and audacity of those who executed it, the fragility and complicity of the systems it bypassed, and the uneasy ethics of a world where survival often demands transgression. The operation's brilliance lay not only in what it accomplished, but in how it reshaped perceptions. That intelligence work is as much about bending expectation as it is about gathering information, that secrecy can be a weapon, and that the consequences of audacious acts extend far beyond the moment they are committed. Years later, the Mediterranean kept its secrets, as it had before. The Scheersberg, long since decomposed into memory and records, no longer carried physical cargo, yet it remained alive in the minds of those who had seen it glide through moonless nights. Scholars traced its route, analysts reconstructed its movements, and the descendants of those involved inherited a story whose magnitude they could barely comprehend. The drums that had once contained uranium had long been absorbed into history, but the lessons of precision, patience, and peril continued to resonate. In the end, Plumbat is remembered as both a masterstroke and a moral puzzle. It was a theft executed with the precision of a heist, yet carried out in the name of national survival, a quiet triumph that reshaped strategy, policy, and the human understanding of risk. The world learned that even the most controlled systems are vulnerable, that audacity can outwit vigilance, and that in the calculus of survival, the lines between legality, morality, and necessity are never fixed. And perhaps that is the true legacy, a reminder that intelligence, like life, is a sequence of choices, each weighted with consequence, each demanding calculation, courage, and sometimes compromise. That the heist that once rolled unseen through the darkness now casts a long shadow across history, teaching lessons about the balance between action and discretion, the cost of secrecy, and the enduring tension between the world as it is and the world as we wish it to be. Plumbat survives, then, not merely as an operation, but as a story, a test, and a warning. Its echo lingers in ports and offices, in vaults and archives, in conversations whispered in corridors, and in the minds of those who recognize both the brilliance and the peril of daring acts done in the shadows. It reminds us that sometimes the most audacious heist is not about material gain, but about the invisible currency of power, secrecy, and survival. And in that ledger, the most consequential entries are often written in silence. As the dust settles on this audacious operation, we're left with more questions than answers. A mission so bold it outsmarted the world's most powerful intelligence agencies, yet executed in silence, secrecy, and shadow. The uranium moved, the mission succeeded, and history only whispers the story to those who know where to listen. If tonight's journey into covert operations and hidden heists intrigued you, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another deep dive into espionage, betrayals, and the secrets history tried to bury. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this story reach corners of the world I can only imagine. Until next time, keep your eyes open, your questions sharp, and remember, some of history's most daring acts remain invisible until someone uncovers them.